Our first speaker today is the Director of the Broome County Planning Department, otherwise known as Mr. Flood Map. Is that appropriate, Frank, if I call you that?
I legally changed my middle name, Dr. Flood.
You Dr. Flood Map. All right. So Frank is like the person in Broome County who is intimately involved with what's happening with the flood maps. And he graciously agreed to come and share with us today. So please help me give a warm welcome to Frank Evangelisti from Broome County.
Thank you all for having me out here today. I am the Director of Planning for Broome County. I've been with the county for 20 years, which means I've been through 2 historic floods. I also grew up in this area, so I go all the way back, and I remember Hurricane Agnes. And I saw the devastation, and my staff worked very closely with the communities to help them recover, and also to try to develop mitigation strategies. But that's not what we're here to talk about today. Today we're here to talk about flood maps and the status of those flood maps. So if we could go to the first slide. So I hate acronyms. I don't like acronyms in anything, but if you're dealing with FEMA, you got to deal with acronyms. And the first thing I want to talk about is FIRMs. These are flood insurance rate maps. These are the maps that show the high-risk areas, the special flood hazard areas, SFHA. Those are only 2 acronyms for today. And those are the areas that have a 1% chance of flooding in any given year. So quick quiz, if a community floods, has that 1% flood, what are the chances that they're going to have a flood the following year? Same, another 1%. So some people, if anybody here today uses 100-year floodplain, I will wash your mouth out with soap because it implies that, hey, we had a flood last year, we're good for another 99 years. That's not how it works. It's every year, if you're in the special flood hazard area, you have a 1% chance of flooding. So the way the process works is FEMA draws those maps. They hire consultants to draw those maps. They bring them out to the community. The communities then adopt those maps if they're participating in the flood insurance program, which all the communities here do locally. And then those maps have legal and financial consequences. They trigger different building standards. They trigger the requirement for flood insurance, etc. But they also inform the community about your flood risk. And that's how us as planners, that's how we use them. We look at those and say, this is a flood prone area. We need to be concerned about that. We need to plan things differently there. So by a show of hands, how many people think the flood maps were updated a few years ago? That is awesome. I was going to say by applause, but I'm glad I didn't because that would have been awkward. So that's what we're here to talk about today. We could go to the next slide. So all of the local flood insurance maps are old. They're from the 1970s and the 1980s. And there's some consequences with that. So we could go to the next one. So first, they do not line up with our modern maps. We use computerized mapping called GIS or Geographic Information Systems. Those old maps don't line up very well with that. That's problem number 1. Problem number 2 is they don't have accurate topography. FEMA actually came through the area. They flew what's called LIDAR, which is a very advanced mechanism for mapping the area. So we have accurate topography for the area that's not shown on those flood maps. They do not reflect the changes in land use. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute. You know, we're a declining community, but we've also been a sprawling community, and that's had an impact on our flood risk. And they do not reflect the changes in weather patterns, which is probably the biggest change in the community over the last 50 years. Okay, you could go. So I think most people know that we've lost population from 1950 to 2010. The urban core lost about 37% population, but the suburban and rural areas gained in population. People, yes, some people moved south, but a lot of people moved out of the urban core into the rural and suburban areas. So what used to be a farmer's field is now a driveway and a roof and gutters, and all of that adds more runoff than we used to have. Since 2012, every year, 715 acres of farmland has been converted to other uses. Now, not all of that is development. Some of it's going vacant, but that's the kind of development that's been taking place and also adding to our flood risk. And again, not shown on these maps from the 1970s and 1980s. Go ahead. So this is just a quick demonstration of the impact of those changes in flood use. If you look at land that's completely undeveloped, virgin forest, about 10% of the water is going to run off out when there's a heavy rain, is going to run off. The rest of it's going to go into the ground or go back up into the air through evapotranspiration. I remember that from 9th grade earth science, the only thing I remember. We go to the next one. So if we look at more of the sort of the rural landscape, about 20% of the water runs off, okay? If we go to the next one, it's 30%. So that's what we've gone from, is that sort of rural landscape to more development, and we've picked up that extra amount of runoff. And then the last one is the urban core, 55%. That's not what's really happening. We're kind of going from the 20% to the 30%. So that's generating more runoff. We go to the next slide. The other thing that's happening is the changing weather patterns. This is the actual changes in weather of heavy weather events from 1958 to 2012. So basically to today. The Northeast has seen a 71% increase in heavy precipitation. And that's a concern for us here because we have these steep sloped hills, a lot of clay soils. The rain comes off those hills very quickly and adds to our flood risk. So we're seeing more heavy rain events, not just more rain, but more heavy rain events. And that's not reflected in our flood maps. So go to the next one. The result of all these changes is FEMA has seen a dramatically expensive weather events. These are FEMA's flood insurance payouts, and you can see Katrina basically broke the bank. I mean, they made the flood insurance program not solvent, and then Sandy, kind of was the knockout blow after that. So as a result of this, FEMA has did decide they need to update our maps. So Congress authorized $1 billion 5-year effort to update the maps. The 2006 floods put us at the very front of the list for new maps. We kind of moved to the front because they saw that things were really not very accurate here. So the next one. 2010, FEMA comes to the area. They met with officials. They held community workshops, and they produced preliminary firms. They produced these maps digitally, paper. We commented on those, and they were very close. They were within weeks of finalizing those. But across the country, people were complaining about the methodology that FEMA was using. They thought it was too simplistic. They didn't like it. So FEMA responded by withdrawing all of the maps that had not been adopted nationwide, ours included, but everybody else's. So if you hit so FEMA did not finalize those firm maps. They produced them. We have them. But they're not the legally adopted maps. They're not what people are bound to follow. If you could go next one. So I passed out this fact sheet. Hopefully everybody has that. And if you're not, there's more around. This is FEMA's official fact sheet for Broome County. And I'm going to just, there's a lot of material, information here that you can digest on your own, but I'm going to read just a couple sentences to you. At this time, this is from the fact sheet from 2018, at this time FEMA has not scheduled a remapping initiative for Broome County. Any future remapping updates will be based on available funding and no date has been determined. For now, the 1970s and 80s maps remain in effect for flood insurance rating purposes. When I talk to FEMA, they'll say years and years away. I mean, even if they started tomorrow, it would be years away, and there's no plans to start tomorrow. So there's no new flood maps on the horizon. The next one. This is the other thing that I think is important. Although not legally binding, the 2010 preliminary maps may be helpful in making decisions. That's how we use them. So we can't make people follow those maps, but we can use them when we, the planning department, are reviewing projects. We'll take a look at the project and say, you know, it's in the preliminary floodplain, special flood hazard area, and, you know, we think they should, the project should respond accordingly. So we go to the next one. So bottom line, and everybody seems to know this, the existing firms from the 1970s and 1980s remain in place, okay? Is everybody familiar with bcgis.com? All right. Making me nervous up here. That's our website. We put all the information that we have in the world that's mappable, we try to put on that website. If you go there, you're going to want to use the parcel mapper. If you go to the next one, and open up the floodplain, and you'll see all of these different floodplains that we have, all these different maps, we put them all there so you have access to them. If you could hit that button. So the one that says existing FEMA floodplain, those are the legally enforceable firm maps. Those are the ones from 1970s and 1980s. That's what, you know, building departments, that's what flood insurance folks use. Go to the next one. We also have up there the preliminary FEMA floodplain. Those are the withdrawn maps, the maps that they put out and then took back. But they're there and they're helpful, and I'll talk about why in a minute. The next one, if you hit the next one as well. So the next two are the 2006 and 2011 flood inundation. So what happened after both of those events, or during those events, NYSEG flew over the area and took extensive digital pictures of the urban core. They didn't fly the whole county, but they took pictures of the urban core. They then went back and mapped the visible water, where they could see water. So those maps are these 2011 and 2006 flood inundations. It doesn't capture everything. So there's people that got water in their basement that aren't going to be shown there because that's visible water on the surface. There's also going to be instances where they didn't get there at the very peak of the flooding. Or maybe they got there an hour later and the water had receded, you know, a foot, 2 foot, whatever. So it's not perfect, but if you're in one of these areas, you flooded. Okay, so it doesn't capture everything that flooded, but everything that's in there, I would be confident to say that it flooded. Okay, so that's again another thing that you can use when looking at properties. So if you go to the next one. So this is just a comparison. The dark blue, that's the existing FEMA firm map for this area. Okay, that's Route 17 between 17 and Harry L. Drive. And the light blue is what actually flooded in 2006. So you can see it really wasn't very predictive of the flooding in that area. If you go to the next one, this is the preliminary flood map, the dark blue being the special flood hazard area, and the lighter blue being, I'm going to say, the 500-year floodplain. This is what the preliminary maps show for that area. If you could go to the next one, you'll see this is what actually flooded in 2011. So it's not perfect, but it's a lot closer. That's why we use these maps. They're fairly predictive of the flooding. The other thing I would say too is not every flood is the same. You know, the storm center could center over Conklin and flood that area more, or center over western Broome and flood that area more. So it's not like when we get a flood, all of the special flood hazard area is going to flood. Okay? So we go to the next one. Any questions for me? Easy questions first. Nothing? Yes.
The question that always seems to be coming up is the flood levee walls. And they're not certified is why a lot of the property is in a floodplain now. Could you go
Okay,
a little bit?
so yeah, I'll talk about that as much as I can, as much as I have the intellectual capacity to talk about it, which is declining as the day goes on. So right now, all of the flood maps are from the 70s, from an era when those levees and flood walls are certified. So certification is not going to change the existing flood maps. Does that make sense? So the levees were built in the 50s, the maps are from the 70s, and they're all in, you know, it's as if those levees and flood walls are protective and they're certified. If we get new maps, that's where the issue becomes. And that's what happened with these maps, the preliminary maps. They looked at those levees and flood walls and said, they're not certified, they're not protective, we're going to ignore them when we draw our new maps, okay? That hasn't happened yet. So the next thing to understand is the levees and flood walls, the certification process is very expensive and complex. The first thing you have to have, though, to be completely out of the floodplain is to have the wall be high enough. And a lot of them, for the most part, they're not high enough to remove yourself entirely from the floodplain. They're just physically shorter. Things have changed. We're getting more rain. In some small areas, they are tall. They are high enough, and those are the areas that could think about getting accreditation. Okay, and that's what I think the mayor is going to come and talk to you about this afternoon. There's a portion of the flood wall in the first ward that I think is tall enough, and it makes sense to, it may make sense to look at accreditation. Up until right now, it hasn't been prudent to go through that process because the Army Corps has been looking at all the flood walls in the area and deciding whether they wanted to raise them or do some other project. So it was sort of made sense to hold off on doing any big accreditation process until just recently, if that.
So the Army Corps.
First of all, I want to say, you started with, I said start with an easy question, but go ahead.
So the Army Corps is in the process of looking at all the walls?
Yeah, so the Army Corps is in the process of looking at every possible, what can we possibly do in this area, big scale projects. I think ultimately it's going to come back to not touching the walls, but that's a relatively recent development. They haven't finalized that report yet. That's what I expect the report to say later this year, but they've been working on this for 3 years now, so that's coming to a head, later this year. Yes, in the back.
Do the management of the rivers have anything to do with the part of the study of the flood walls, the levees, any of that? 'Cause it seemed like that created an awful lot of distress to our properties to the west, especially as you got into Tioga County.
How do you mean the management of the rivers? Like the reservoir?
Like trees blocking water, spilling out onto properties, creating barriers.
So, yep, so things like that tend to have impacts in localized areas, and that's where they can have a big impact. A couple trees come down and it blocks a culvert and suddenly everybody upstream is. So I think, again, I'm not a hydrologist, I think for the most part FEMA looks at bigger picture things than that. We actually, the county, are in the process of raising a bridge in Vestal just for that reason, so that it'll have more span and function. And a lot of the communities went through and addressed a lot of those types of issues to address the smaller, more localized issues. Yes.
I don't know if anybody else has trouble reading the maps when you look at them.
Are you saying that a FEMA document is not clear? Is that what I'm hearing? I'm not sure. Okay, go ahead. I'll continue with your question.
The colors of them are, some of them are so close to each other.
Yeah.
That it's hard to tell if it's in a flood zone, not in a flood zone, in a partial flood zone, or,
Uh-huh.
could the legends be a little clearer as to what they are, or the colors be a lot more different?
Sure, we can look at that. So are you talking about our maps or at the FEMA website? I don't want to I'm trying to be a jerk, but I can't control the FEMA website. Are you talking about at BCGIS?
Yeah.
Okay, so we can take a look at that. The other thing too is you can click on it. You can click on any parcel and see the parcel details, and it will tell you in, out, partially in.
I know that, just
So,
because with the map.
Yeah, so I could talk to our GIS person. He's probably listening in, and we'll fix that before I get back to the office. He's that fast.
So along the lines of river management, I hear complaints occasionally from friends and clients who live along the waterway saying, oh, damn county, if I could get them over here to dredge out this river, dredge out this creek.
22 minutes till we heard the word dredging. I don't know if that's a record or not. So,
Is that really gonna have any impact?
no, I'm to be honest with you, no. So here's why. So you can go back to them and say this. First of all, the county can't. But let's imagine that we could. Let's imagine that we could go and dredge the rivers. If you go to downtown Binghamton, stand right next to the flood wall, and look at the other flood wall across the water was lapping up to the top of that, and that depth is amazing. Dredging a couple feet is not going to it's not going to have any impact, really, just practically. The second thing is, right now, the rivers are relatively stable. We basically know what's gonna flood and what's not gonna flood. You start changing that, you start going in there digging, and now suddenly the rivers can carry a lot, travel a lot faster, can carry a lot heavier debris loads, and you're gonna have a lot more, you may have more flooding and more unpredictable flooding. They're also gonna fill back in. The minute the dredging operation ends, it's gonna start filling back in an unpredictable way, and it is also quite expensive. So it's been, the Army Corps did look, I believe, looked at that in their study, but it is quite an expensive thing. Where it might make sense is where a creek enters the river, and that's maybe causing some backup up that creek, but large-scale dredging the rivers would be unproductive, expensive, and ultimately just fill itself back in. Yes.
Back to the question about the coloring. The other day, I was looking up a bunch of properties, and every property said out, 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 but when I looked at the map, every property was completely in blue, so I don't understand.
So if you send me an email, I was gonna say I didn't put my email up there, but I did. If you send me an email, we'll take a look at an individual property. It may be that you were looking at, had one, the 2006 on, and you were looking at 2011 or something like that, but.
Well, so the question is, what am I supposed to look at?
From a legal perspective, you should be looking at the existing floodplain. That's the legal requirement. The rest of them are there to be informative and to help people understand their flood risk.
Okay, one last question. Go ahead, and then we gotta keep moving.
Okay.
Let Frank,
So are
Frank has to depart as well. Go ahead.
So are banks gonna be looking at the old maps, or are they still?
That's a good segue. That's a good segue to our
Yeah.
next presenter.
Yeah, so I'll leave that to the next one, because it's really, that's sort of the bank's call.
Yeah. I didn't pay you to ask that question.
I certainly didn't pay you to ask that question. All right, thank you very
Okay,
much.
thank-